long, I would now like to introduce our first speaker, which is Gizem Arikan. I hope I have pronounced that correctly. Gizem is Assistant Professor of Political Psychology in the Department of Political Science at Trinity College Dublin. Her research focuses on the effects of religiosity, values, and authoritarianism on political attitudes, including attitudes towards democracy, and she has published indeed in top journals such as the American Political Science Review, the British Journal of Political Science, Comparative Political Studies, Political Psychology and Political Behavior. She's also the winner of Turkish Academy of Sciences 2015 Young Scientist Outstanding Achievement Award and Science Academy Young Scientist Award in 2016. And she will be talking to us today for the next 12-13 minutes. So Gizem, to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Daphne. I am going to share my screen first. Okay. So again, thank you very much, Daphne. My talk is about how we respond to threats in our environment and how threatening situations may undermine popular support for democratic norms such as civil liberties. I'm going to be presenting some evidence from a recent study showing that even individuals who value freedom and autonomy are susceptible to the effects of threats. So dangerous situations such as an infectious disease like COVID-19 lead to fears among individuals that they themselves or their society could be affected. They may fear that they or someone that they love may get sick, may die, or they may be worried about the well-being of their nation or of their society. So we call these type of fears perceived threats. And as we are all aware, COVID-19 has also had immense effects on the economy. So individuals may also fear the consequences of bad economy. And again, they may feel these threats at a personal level, that they are insecure or they may be economically insecure. But they may also fear the consequences of this economic situation, of shrinking economies for their society as well. So both types of threats have been found to be prevalent among the public, and usually COVID-related economic threats were more prevalent in public opinion surveys. So I wanted to focus a bit on what these threats mean for individual support for democratic freedoms. Just try to move on to the next slide. So a lot of research in political psychology shows that threats have wide-ranging implications for political attitudes. So when individuals are faced with a threatening situation, they would like to find a way to reduce these threats. So they want to feel more secure. One way of trying to resolve this threatening situation is by supporting strong, forceful, powerful leadership. So during crisis periods, we usually see greater support for strong leadership. Coalescing around the leaders is one way to deal with this increasing sense of threat. Desire for increased security also leads to widespread support for tough law and order policies. These policies usually ensure safety and security, but they come at the expense of individual freedoms and civil liberties. Overall, there is, again, increased support for these type of policies that trade liberty for security in crisis period. And perceived threats are also related to the desire for retaliation. So people are generally more willing to support harsh punishments for people or groups that they feel threaten public safety during these periods. Now, as you can guess, individuals have different levels of susceptibility towards these threats. So some individuals are more affected and some individuals are less affected by these threats. What I'm going to show you is that certain type of threats can actually influence even the most freedom-loving, autonomous, open-minded individuals. So in the rest of my talk, I'm going to refer to a psychological orientation called authoritarianism to explain this dynamic and its relationship to perceived threats and support for anti-democratic attitudes, if you will. So authoritarianism is a psychological orientation that reflects a preference for order, conformity to norms, and deference to authority, as opposed to individual autonomy. So if authoritarians are to choose between authority or autonomy, they are likely to choose authority. And this is because these people are generally like to perceive the world as dangerous and threatening. And so in general, they are more likely to support strong leadership or tough law and order policies because these policies are in line with their motivation to attain security. And their level of support for these type of anti-democratic, tough policies tend to increase if authoritarians perceive threats to existing social order. So how about those who are at the other end of the spectrum, so non-authoritarians or those who value autonomy over authority? I'm going to show that some types of threats also make these individuals act very much like authoritarians, and they are threats to personal well-being rather than threats to social safety or security. So to provide evidence for this, I collected data from a small sample of respondents in New York and New Jersey during April, so when the spread of the pandemic was reaching its peak. And distinguishing between type of threats is not easy in a survey situation. When people are threatened, they tend to express high levels of threat for basically everything. This is why there's a small experiment embedded in the survey. So a randomly assigned group of individuals answer questions on perceived personal threats from COVID-19. Right after that, they are answering some questions about support for some controversial law and order policies to contain the coronavirus. And some randomly assigned individuals are answering first questions on perceived societal or sociotropic threats from COVID-19. And a group of individuals are just answering these questions. So what we want to see here is whether making certain types of threats salient is going to impact the way people respond to these law and order or harsh punishment type of questions. And I just have two very illustrative results. So it looks like the effects were in the way that I expected, and the literature in line with the literature. So when sociotropic threats are made salient, authoritarian support for tough law and order policies increased. So they responded to salient societal threats by increasing their level of support for instance, increasing the number of security forces. And those non-authoritarians, those that are at the other end of the spectrum, also increased their support for tough law and order policies, but it was when they were when personal threats were made salient in the experiment. So again, just some illustrative results. And in fact, I found highly consistent effects of personal threats on support for tough law and order policies for non-authoritarians in the study, again, in line with some of the previous findings in the literature. So there are also, I also found similar effects for support for harsh punishments, but these effects were relatively limited. So there is evidence that public support for anti-democratic policies could increase under threatening situations, depending on the salience of different types of threats, but these threats, again, could influence even the most freedom-loving individuals. So before I conclude, there is one caveat or one going further point that I would like to mention. One robust finding in the political psychology literature is that threats trigger a whole spectrum of other behaviors. And one type of this behavior is increased prejudice and intolerance towards threatening groups or out groups. So people perceive out groups as more threatening. And these groups need not be the source of threat. So during periods of economic insecurity, prejudice or intolerance towards religious minorities, immigrants, or foreigners may increase. I have not yet looked at the effect of personal threats on non-authoritarians' levels of prejudice, but this is a possibility. I would like to answer your questions in the Q&A. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gizem, for that. That's very interesting. We already have a couple of questions. I have a couple of questions too, but that's all for later.